In the summer of 1943, on the rolling plains around the city of Kursk, the fate of the Second World War was decided not in a single charge, but in a grinding struggle of men, steel, and fire. Millions were drawn into a battle, so vast that it eclipsed every class that came before it. Here, for the first time, the German blitzkrieg was stopped and broken, and the strategic initiative of the war shifted forever. The Battle of Kursk stands as one of the most decisive and consequential confrontations in the history of modern warfare, fought between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union during the summer of 1943. It was not merely a battle, but a colossal struggle that involved an unprecedented concentration of human and industrial power. Millions of soldiers were committed along a front that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, forming one of the largest concentrations of manpower ever assembled in a single theater of war. On the German side alone, nearly 1 million men were, supported by more than 2,700 tanks and assault guns, over 10,000 artillery pieces, and close to 2,000 combat aircraft opposing them. The Soviet Union deployed more than 1,300,000 troops, backed by roughly 3,500 tanks, more than 20,000 field guns and mortars, and over 2,600 aircraft. Day and night, the skies above the Kursk salient were filled with the constant roar of engines as bombers, fighters, and ground attack aircraft launched repeated missions to strike enemy positions, supply lines, and armored columns. This immense coordination of infantry, armor, artillery, and air power transformed the battlefield into a continuous zone of combat, where the scale of forces involved reflected the full industrial and human capacity of total war. Never before had opposing armies committed such enormous numbers of armored vehicles to a single operation. Entire landscapes were transformed into killing grounds where steel columns advanced under relentless artillery fire while aircraft filled the skies in continuous waves of attack and interception. The intensity of the fighting reached a level at which entire battalions could be shattered or rendered combat ineffective within the span of a single morning or afternoon. Tank brigades entered the battle with full strength and emerged hours later reduced to a fraction of their original numbers. Their vehicles burned out or abandoned across the fields. Artillery batteries were wiped out by counterfire. Infantry regiments suffered thousands of casualties in a single day, and command structures collapsed under the weight of constant bombardment. By the end of the battle, German forces had lost hundreds of tanks and tens of thousands of men, while Soviet losses ran even higher, with well over 1,000 armored vehicles destroyed and casualties reaching into the hundreds of thousands. Such losses, sustained in so short a time and across so wide a front, underscored the unprecedented brutality of the struggle and marked the Battle of Kursk as one of the most destructive engagements in the history of warfare. The scale of destruction was not confined to military forces alone. Across the Kursk region, the destruction extended far beyond the frontline positions and engulfed the entire civilian landscape. Hundreds of villages were reduced to rubble by artillery barrages and aerial bombing, while vast stretches of farmland were torn apart by shell craters, tank tracks, and mine explosions. Roads, bridges, and railway lines, essential for the movement of men and supplies, were systematically targeted and destroyed, severing communications across dozens of kilometers. Entire districts were transformed into fields of debris, scorched earth, and twisted metal, where nothing remained untouched by the violence of mechanized warfare. The shattered terrain that remained stood as a stark testament to the industrial scale of total war, in which the machinery of destruction consumed not only armies, but the land itself. The sheer violence and endurance required of the soldiers surpassed anything previously experienced on the Eastern Front. More importantly, the outcome of the Battle of Kursk fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the war. For the first time, the German army failed to break through a carefully prepared Soviet defense in a major offensive. The loss of men, tanks, and experienced crews weakened German offensive power beyond recovery. From this point onward, The initiative passed permanently to the Red Army, setting in motion a series of Soviet offensives that would drive German forces steadily westward and ultimately toward defeat. Following the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad, the balance of power in the east began to change. The surrender of the 6th Army in early 1943 shocked Germany and shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Wehrmacht. Although German forces under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein managed to stabilize the front and retake cities such as Kharkov, the overall strategic situation had deteriorated. Germany now faced a choice between remaining on the defensive or attempting one final offensive to regain the initiative. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad, Adolf Hitler faced the gravest crisis of his military career. The surrender of the 6th Army in early 1943 was not merely a tactical defeat, but a profound psychological shock that reverberated through every level of the German state. For the first time, an entire German field army had been destroyed and captured. The myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility, carefully cultivated since 1939, was publicly shattered. Across occupied Europe and within Germany itself, confidence in final victory began to erode. On the Eastern Front, the situation appeared increasingly dangerous. Soviet winter offensives had pushed German forces back hundreds of kilometers in several sectors. Supply lines were overstretched, divisions were severely under strength, and operational reserves were dangerously thin. Although German counterattacks under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein managed to stabilize the front and recapture key cities, such as Kharkov, these successes concealed deeper strategic weaknesses. Germany no longer possessed the freedom of action it had enjoyed in earlier years. Every major decision now carried potentially irreversible consequences. Hitler was unwilling to accept a defensive posture. In his worldview, Germany's strength lay in attack rather than endurance. He believed that remaining on the defensive would allow the Soviet Union to exploit its growing superiority in manpower and industrial output. The Red Army was rapidly improving its command structure, coordination, and tactical competence. If left unchallenged, Hitler feared that Soviet offensives would grind down German forces through sheer numerical pressure. From this perspective, Hitler concluded that Germany must strike again, and strike decisively. He believed that only a powerful offensive could restore the initiative and regain control of the war's tempo. This conviction was rooted as much in ideology as in military calculation. Hitler remained convinced that Soviet forces would ultimately collapse under sufficient pressure. As he believed they nearly had in earlier campaigns, the target he selected was the Kursk salient. This vast bulge in the Soviet front line extended deep into German-held territory. It measured more than 200 kilometers across and over 100 kilometers in depth. To German planners, the salient appeared as a dangerous vulnerability. If attacked simultaneously from the north and the south, it seemed possible to encircle and destroy the Soviet armies positioned within it. In theory, the destruction of these forces would eliminate a significant portion of Soviet combat power. German intelligence estimated that several Soviet field armies were deployed in and around the Kursk region. A successful encirclement could result in hundreds of thousands of Soviet casualties and the loss of thousands of tanks and artillery pieces. Such a blow, Hitler believed, would cripple Soviet offensive capability for the remainder of the year. The operation was given the code name Operation Citadel. It was conceived as a classic pincer movement modeled on earlier German successes from the north. General Walter Model's 9th Army would attack southward from the Ural region. From the south, General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, an army detachment camp, would drive northward from the Belgorod area. The two forces were intended to meet east of Kursk, sealing off the salient and annihilating the Soviet formations trapped inside. Hitler promised his generals that the offensive would be supported by overwhelming force. Nearly 1 million German soldiers were allocated to the operation. Approximately 2,700 tanks and assault guns were assembled. More than 10,000 artillery pieces were positioned to support the attack. Nearly 2,000 operational aircraft from the Luftwaffe were committed to provide air support. It represented one of the largest concentrations of German military power ever assembled for a single campaign. Asterisk, a critical element of Hitler's thinking was technological superiority. He placed great faith in new weapons that he believed would restore German battlefield dominance. The Panther tank was intended to counter the Soviet T-34 with superior firepower and armor. The Tiger tank was expected to spearhead breakthroughs with its heavy protection and long-range gun. New self-propelled guns and heavy tank destroyers were also introduced in significant numbers. Hitler believed that superior German engineering would compensate for numerical inferiority. He assumed that experienced crews and aggressive tactics would once again deliver decisive results. This belief underestimated the risks of introducing untested equipment under combat conditions. Mechanical failures, logistical difficulties, and limited training soon reduced the effectiveness of these new machines. The repeated delay of the offensive further complicated matters. Originally planned for early spring, Operation Citadel was postponed several times. Hitler wanted to wait for more Panthers and Tigers to become available. He also sought improved ground conditions after the winter thaw. Each delay, however, gave the Soviet command valuable additional time to prepare. Soviet intelligence was well aware of German intentions through reconnaissance, radio intercepts, and espionage networks. The Red Army obtained a clear picture of German troop movements. Rather than being surprised, the Soviets deliberately chose to absorb the German attack on ground of their own choosing. Marshal Georgy Zhukov argued strongly against launching a preemptive Soviet offensive. He believed the Germans should be allowed to exhaust themselves against prepared defenses. Stalin ultimately accepted this assessment. The Soviet strategy was defensive in form, but offensive in intent. Around Kursk, the Red Army constructed a defensive system of unprecedented depth. Multiple belts of trenches were dug, extending up to 100 kilometers behind the front line. Millions of mines were laid to slow and channel German armor. Artillery positions were concealed and pre-registered to deliver devastating fire. Vast reserves were held back to launch counterattacks. At decisive moments, more than 1,300,000 Soviet soldiers were deployed in and around the salient. Approximately 3,500 tanks and self-propelled guns were committed. Over 20,000 artillery pieces supported the defense. More than 2,600 aircraft were assigned to Soviet air forces in the region. These preparations fundamentally altered the nature of the battle, unlike earlier campaigns. German forces achieved no surprise and no rapid breakthrough. Operation Citadel became a battle of attrition from its opening hours. Every kilometer of ground was contested. Every advance carried a heavy cost. Despite warnings from senior commanders, Hitler pressed forward. Some generals argued for a defensive strategy to preserve German strength. Hitler rejected these views outright. To him, inaction meant inevitable defeat. Political necessity, he believed, demanded an offensive victory. On the 5th of July, 1943, the battle began. Soviet artillery opened fire before the German bombardment could commence. German formations were disrupted and thrown into confusion when the German advance finally began. It encountered resistance far stronger than anticipated. Minefields slowed. The tanks, artillery fire devastated advancing infantry. Air attacks harassed supply lines and rear areas. German advances quickly became slow and costly. In the north, Model's 9th Army advanced only a few kilometers despite heavy losses. In the south, Haas forces achieved deeper penetrations, but at an unsustainable price. Tanks were destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Experienced crews were killed or wounded in large numbers. The decisive moment came near Prokhorovka. Soviet reserves were unleashed in a massive counterattack. Hundreds of tanks clashed at close range in chaotic fighting. German technical advantages were negated by the conditions of battle. By mid-July, the German offensive had stalled. At the same time, Allied landings in Sicily forced Hitler to divert resources to another front. Recognizing that success was no longer possible, Hitler ordered the termination of Operation Citadel. German forces withdrew. The Red Army immediately seized the initiative. Soviet counteroffensives followed across the front. German forces were pushed steadily westward. In retrospect, Operation Citadel exposed the fundamental flaws in Hitler's strategic thinking. He overestimated technology and underestimated Soviet capability. He ignored the warnings of experienced commanders. The belief in one decisive blow no longer matched the realities of industrial warfare. The failure at Kursk marked the end of German strategic offensives on the Eastern Front. From that point onward, Germany fought a defensive war it could not win. The Red Army, growing stronger each month, would carry the war to Berlin. Operation Citadel was not merely a failed offensive. It was the moment when Germany lost the initiative forever. In preparation, Germany concentrated enormous resources, nearly 1 million men, thousands of tanks, and vast artillery formations were assembled in preparation for the offensive. New armored vehicles were rushed into frontline service, most notably the Panther and Tiger tanks. Despite having undergone only limited testing and incomplete battlefield trials, the Panther, intended to counter the Soviet T-34, suffered from severe mechanical weaknesses, with early models plagued by engine fires, fragile transmissions, and final drive failures that often disabled the tank before it ever reached combat. During the opening days of the operation, a significant percentage of Panthers broke down due to mechanical faults alone, with some units reporting that fewer than half of their vehicles were operational after only a few days of movement and fighting. Even the formidable Tiger tank, though heavily armored and powerful, faced maintenance challenges, including high fuel consumption, complex repair requirements, and frequent track and suspension damage that limited its mobility on the battlefield. Rushed production schedules, shortages of skilled labor, and pressure to deploy these machines as symbols of German technological superiority resulted in tanks that were impressive on paper, but unreliable in practice, leaving many abandoned or immobilized not by enemy fire, but by their own mechanical failures. The repeated delays in launching the offensive proved to be one of the most consequential factors shaping the battle, granting the Soviet command invaluable time to prepare on an unprecedented scale. What was initially planned as a spring attack was postponed again and again, stretching from April into early July of 1943, as German leaders waited for more tanks, better weather, and additional formations to be assembled. Each delay of weeks, and in some cases months, allowed Soviet engineers and infantry to deepen defensive belts, lay millions of additional mines, and reinforce positions with fresh troops and artillery. During this period, the Red Army expanded its defensive system around Kursk to include up to 8 successive lines of fortifications, extending in depth for more than 100 kilometers. By the time the German attack finally began, the element of surprise had vanished, and the battlefield had been transformed into a meticulously prepared defensive zone, shaped directly by the time lost through German hesitation and delay. The Soviet leadership, fully aware of German intentions through intelligence and reconnaissance, adopted a strategy of deliberate defense. Marshal Georgy Zhukov proposed a deliberate and calculated strategy that called for allowing German forces to launch the initial assault against heavily fortified Soviet positions, rather than attempting a premature counteroffensive. His plan centered on drawing the main German armored formations into a series of deeply prepared defensive belts, including the Voronezh Front and Central Front positions, where their strength could be systematically worn down. The first defensive zone was designed to absorb the initial shock, using minefields, anti-tank ditches, and forward infantry trenches to slow and disrupt the German advance behind it. Second and third defensive belts contained massed artillery, anti-tank guns, and mobile reserves positioned to inflict maximum losses as German units attempted to break through. Once the attacking forces had expended their momentum, suffered heavy tank losses, and become disorganized, Zhukov planned to unleash powerful reserve armies, including the Steppe Front, in a coordinated counterattack aimed at regaining lost ground and destroying the weakened German spearheads. Around Kursk, the Red Army constructed multiple defensive belts with trenches, minefields, barbed wire, and concealed artillery. Millions of mines were laid, and vast reserves were held back for decisive counterblows. By early July, the stage was set. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 5th of July, 1943, the stillness along the front was shattered as Soviet artillery suddenly erupted in a thunderous barrage aimed at German assembly areas and staging grounds. Thousands of guns and rocket launchers opened fire almost simultaneously, turning the night sky into a continuous sheet of flame and explosions that illuminated the landscape. For kilometers in every direction, shells crashed into troop concentrations, command posts, and tank formations that had been preparing to launch their own attack, disrupting schedules and sowing confusion before the German offensive could even begin. The sheer volume of fire, sustained and precisely targeted, demonstrated the immense scale of the battle about to unfold and signaled that the Red Army was not merely prepared, but waiting. What was intended to be a carefully timed German assault instead began under the shock and chaos of one of the largest preparatory artillery barrages of the war, marking the opening moments of a confrontation unlike anything seen before on the Eastern Front. Shortly after the Soviet barrage subsided, the German assault finally began along a front stretching for hundreds of kilometers as whistles, engines, and shouted commands signaled the start of the long-anticipated offensive. Columns of infantry rose from their positions and moved forward into a landscape already torn apart by shellfire, advancing step by step under the constant threat of artillery bursts, machine gun fire, and exploding mines that ripped gaps through their ranks and shattered unit cohesion. Behind the infantry came the armored waves, as hundreds of tanks and assault guns surged forward in dense formations, their engines roaring while aircraft from the Luftwaffe thundered overhead in coordinated strikes. Stuka dive bombers and fighter aircraft attacked Soviet positions and attempted to suppress anti-tank guns, even as Soviet fighters and ground fire contested the skies, transforming the battlefield into a vast, multi-layered arena of combat in which land and air forces clashed simultaneously on an unprecedented scale. Progress along the front was agonizingly slow, measured not in kilometers gained, but in meters paid for with heavy losses, as German units advanced through shattered terrain. Under constant fire, every movement forward required hours of clearing minefields, bridging anti-tank ditches, and fighting through successive trench lines, while artillery and anti-tank guns inflicted steady attrition on men and machines alike. The resistance German forces encountered exceeded anything they had faced in earlier campaigns, both in scale and intensity. Soviet defenders fought from layered positions that refused to collapse, launching immediate counterfire and local counterattacks, ensuring that each German gain came at a punishing cost in time, fuel, equipment, and lives. In the northern sector, General Walter Model's 9th Army struggled to advance more than a few kilometers. Despite fierce fighting in the south, General Hermann Haas' 4th Panzer Army achieved deeper penetrations, but at a heavy price. Everywhere, German forces were worn down by dense defenses, constant artillery fire, and relentless Soviet resistance. As the days passed, the battlefield became a scene of continual combat by land and air. The Luftwaffe and the Red Air Force fought massive aerial battles, while tank engagements raged across fields and villages. Despite local gains, German momentum steadily faded, mechanical failures, fuel shortages, and mounting losses reduced the effectiveness of even the most powerful armored units. The climax came near the village of Prokhorovka. There, on the 12th of July, Soviet reserve armies launched a massive counterattack against the advancing German formations. Hundreds of tanks collided at close range in chaotic, brutal fighting. The engagement devolved into a confused struggle, where individual crews fought for survival amid smoke, fire, and exploding ammunition. The advantages of German armor and long range vanished, and the sheer numbers and mobility of Soviet tanks blunted the attack. By the end of the day, the German offensive had lost its force. At the same time, news of Allied landings in Sicily reached Hitler's headquarters. Faced with growing threats elsewhere, Hitler ordered the withdrawal of key armored units from the Kursk front. The opportunity for victory was gone. The Red Army immediately seized the initiative, launching powerful counteroffensives. Soviet forces pushed the Germans back along the entire front. Although Soviet losses were severe, their industrial capacity and manpower reserves allowed them to recover rapidly. Germany, by contrast, could not replace its losses at the same pace. Operation Citadel ended in failure. It marked the last major German offensive in the east and a decisive turning point in the war. From Kursk onward, the strategic initiative belonged to the Soviet Union. The Red Army would continue its advance westward, driving German forces back toward Berlin. The Battle of Kursk demonstrated the era of German dominance on the Eastern Front was over. It was a battle of endurance and preparation where defensive depth, intelligence, and reserves proved decisive in the fields around Kursk. The course of the Second World War was irrevocably changed.